Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Coach Sam. If it's your first time around here, we have a series breaking down all of the major conferences leading up to week 0 in the college football season. Previously, we've talked the Big 12, the Pac-12, and the ACC. So today's episode is the Big 10, the conference that has produced the last 3 national champions in Indiana, Ohio State, and Michigan. So does that mean it's Oregon or USC's times this year? Let's talk about it. 8 out of the top 20 teams in college football last year came out of the Big 10. They have over 50% of their teams returning 60% or more of their talent from last year. And there's 10 teams in this conference projected to finish within the top 40 this season. So obviously, the Big 10 will produce hitters, will produce teams playing in the bowl games. There's good depth on the offense and defensive side of the ball with a lot of these teams. So let's talk all 18 and rank them into 4 tiers. The first tier are going to be teams who we think are really battling to try and get to that 6-win mark, become bowl eligible. There's a few teams who we think this year might just be a little meh. They'll probably remain bowl eligible, but I think a season of 9 wins would be their absolute ceiling. The tier after that, some teams who are kind of good. Right, when we look at the top of this conference, the Indianas, the Ohio States, Michigan, Oregon, it's going to be tough to compete with the big dogs. However, being kind of good in the Big 10 usually means you win about 9 or 10 games, and you're oftentimes playing in one of the best bowls. Not something, that nobody wants to watch, but oftentimes something where maybe it's the Pop-Tart Bowl, maybe it's the Duke's Mayo Bowl, along those lines. So, first things first, we have to run the intro. After that, make sure you go down to the comments. Let me know who you think is winning the Big 10. Like the video, subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on, and let's get into it.
And tonight, I submit to you that there's some family that drove from I don't know where, parked 5 miles out away from this stadium, and they saved all freaking year long just to buy a ticket to climb to the top of that stadium and watch your tail play. You owe them something.
Alright, if you're new around here, this is part of our series breaking down all of the major conferences leading up to week 0 in the college football season. But we also run a show called Sam Center 3 times a week. Make sure you check that out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Without further ado, let's get into the tier list. The first team we're going to talk is Luke Fickell's squad over there in Wisconsin. A team that brought in a good transfer class, led by one of the top high school recruits in the nation, in Colton Joseph. Luke Fickell has been consistent over there in Wisconsin. They've won a lot of games. They've been ranked at different times in their program. However, this year, I'm not entirely sure what their ceiling is. Their defense should be pretty good. They brought in a lot of transfers again. A couple guys from Division 3, a guy from Old Dominion who really lit it up over there. But I'm just wondering if some of that talent is going to be able to transfer immediately to the Big 10, or if they need a little bit of time to settle in. Along with the quarterback in Colton Joseph, they have a new wide receiver group, and honestly for them, there's only one guy coming back from that group who's caught more than 11 passes last season. So that could be a big area for concern. I do like the running back transfer they brought in from Iowa State. I like what Luke Fickell and his team is going to do on defense. Bring in a cornerback from Arizona State, a safety from Miami, from TCU. Bring in some guys from Division 3, from Old Dominion like we talked about. Wisconsin could be a team that maybe surprises this year. However, I think they are the first team firmly in our tier of meh. I'm just not sure what their ceiling is. I believe in that squad over there to win at least 6 games, 7 games, so I'm not really worried about them battling to become bowl eligible. However, I just think their ceiling is limited with the quarterback they have and with their skill position groups, especially in the Big 10, it's going to be a difficult year. Maryland, a team led by head coach Mike Locksley, back-to-back 4-8 seasons. Last season, they ran out a ton of inexperienced guys. So when we pull up the continuity chart, you're going to see Maryland, 71% of their players are returning from last year. That's because they gave a lot of freshmen an opportunity to start. They like playing for their coach. They didn't win a ton of games, but winning 4 games in a conference like the Big Ten, when you run out a true freshman quarterback in Malik Washington, a guy who decided to come back to Maryland, come back to the program, play again for his head coach, it should help him because they got a ton of skill position players in the portal and from high school. A lot of wide receivers and tight ends, a new offensive coordinator, and a returning offensive line that should hopefully make a big difference for the offense of Maryland. An improved defense over the past couple years. 2 years ago, 74th in the nation. Last year, 54th. So if that defense can continue to improve, maybe bring in some of these guys from the portal, from their high school class, to add to an existing team that is returning 71% of their talent from last year, I think Maryland is a team, realistically, that could surprise some people. I'm not entirely sold on them, going up there and winning a bunch of games this year. I don't think they're going to compete for the top of the Big Ten. However, a 9 or an 8 win season for Maryland being meh, I think is their absolute floor. So I have them better than Wisconsin. I have them better than a few teams here. I just think with the conference they play in, with the depth that they're going to be lacking on the defensive side of the ball, anything more than 8 or 9 wins is really going to be a stretch for this team. However, I really do see them becoming bowl eligible and making them a way to win at least 6 games with a ceiling of about 8. UCLA, a team led by first-year head coach, at least with the Bruins, Bob Chesney. A name that you should recognize. He has won, and he's won big at every single program he's ever been at. Salve Regina, a program, a small school in Rhode Island, he won. Assumption Division III, turned that program around. He went out there, won big at Holy Cross. And then most recently, his past 2 years at James Madison, bringing them to the college football playoffs. That's not a school you expect to be ranked in the top 25, let alone the top 12 teams in the nation. Now, obviously, there's some other factors coming into play. I think James Madison got fairly fortunate, with the ACC being a disaster last year, with the way that all things worked out. So maybe they have Duke to thank for that. However, I do think they were one of the better teams, at least outside of the major conferences. So for Bob Chesney, there's a lot of hype around UCLA this season. Returning a decent amount of talent, including starting quarterback Nico Lamaleva, a guy who was brought in to change the offense. However, he struggled a little bit in his first year. He did show potential, and now with a new coaching staff, a guy in Bob Chesney, they have a running back who is going to be extremely talented in Wayne Knight. They have a good amount of wide receiver talent, and you're looking at having the focal point of that offense obviously be your quarterback and be that quick to intermediate passing game. You don't need to rush Nico into the playbook immediately because that's where he started to make mistakes last year. The offensive line let him down, holding the ball a little bit too long in the pocket. So bringing in an all-new supporting cast for him ultimately should be a good thing. A ton of talent came over from James Madison, and I'm not entirely sure that's a good thing. However, maybe you're looking at the next Curt Cignetti. I don't know if that's the immediate future for UCLA as of this season, but trusting in a head coach, trusting in a roster who has won and won together, and also returning a lot of good talent, a lot of resources over there for the UCLA Bruins, they are going to be our first team who I think is kind of good this year, and they could surprise. They will go out and win at least 8 games and maybe more. PJ Fleck's squad over there in Minnesota, a team that has been extremely consistent for the past 10 seasons, making a lot of bowls, even at times being ranked within that top 25. I'm not entirely sure if this is the next season for them to take that big step. However, you would expect PJ Fleck's team to be firmly in that contention, top 40-ish, pushing for the top 25 depending what their talent looks like. And for them, they have a good defense that is going to borderline on great. They'll be top 20, top 30 in most years. Bringing in returning quarterback starter in Drake Lindsey, a guy who averaged just 9.7 yards per completion last year, and it's 62 overall QBR. That's not good enough in the Big Ten. They haven't had a top 50 offense since 2020, and so when you're looking at things in Minnesota, they're always a difficult place to play. They bring a good defense. They have a fairly good transfer class, as always. I think it's fairly good for PJ Fleck to go out there, hit the recruiting trail. He always does well out of high school. Even bring in guys like Drake Lindsay to come over here to Minnesota when he could have played at other programs. That's going to be a success. For them, they're returning their top running back, 2 out of their 3 top receivers, and 3 out of their starting 5 offensive linemen from last year. A team that needs to build on some of their success and their consistency. Another year in the playbook. I'm going to put Minnesota firmly in our tier as meh. I do think that they have potential this year. I'm not sold on them, winning any more than about 7 or 8 games, but I also cannot see them losing any more than 6. So I do think they'll for sure battle for the bowl, be able to get in that range. Maybe they'll be a top 40 team this season if their defense can come together and if Drake Lindsay can play well on the offensive side of the ball. Illinois, a team led by Brett Bielema. In the past 3 years, if you do not go into Illinois and blow them out, you're in trouble. In the past 3 years, over 76% of the games that have been decided by one score, they've taken home a victory in. That means that they are well coached, they have a good scheme on both offense and defense, they don't beat themselves, and ultimately that's what you'd expect out of a team like Illinois once again this year. Obviously, quarterback Luke Altmaier, he was a big part of that success for a lot of years. He's gone, and in is East Carolina's transfer, Katin Hauser. They're returning 3 out of their top running backs. They've lost their top wide receiver in the portal, and only 1 out of their 5 returning offensive linemen are back. So there's definitely a lot of overhaul on this Illinois team, a team that saw a lot of consistency over the past 3 years. I think they're probably going to try and rely on their offense quite a bit. Katin Hauser can move the ball when he's cutting down on his interceptions, and they do have 3 of their running backs returning. Bobby Hauck, a guy who was the head coach at Montana, he's the new defensive coordinator, so that's going to make a potential impact. He had a good amount of success at Montana, obviously a different level compared to the Big 10. They only have 8 people coming back on defense who played more than 200 snaps last year. So obviously, they hit the transfer portal hard. Bobby brought in a lot of his guys from Montana. They brought in a lot of players from the FBS level, which can be good, and it can also mean that maybe some of these guys won't stick in the conference like the Big 10. Some of them will make a name for themselves, but due to all of the overhaul in this program, I do think that Illinois is still going to remain a tough team to play. You can't doubt Brett Bielema and that coaching squad. However, depth is going to be tested. I don't believe they have the size and the speed to win a lot of games this year. Illinois, you are our first team who will be battling for a bowl. I think trying to get to that 6-win mark is realistic for Illinois. Moving over to Nebraska, the Cornhuskers, led by 4th-year head coach Matt Rule, a name that you'll recognize obviously from the NFL, from other stops in college football. 9 straight years they have not won any more than 7 games. So Nebraska has been consistent, but consistently not great. That needs to change. You're a proud school, but back-to-back 7-win seasons under a guy in Matt Rule who you brought in to change the program is not going to be good enough. Offensive coordinator Dana Holmgren only averaged 370 yards per offense last year, and that's not really going to make a difference in this conference. When you look at some of the top teams, they're putting up a lot of yards, and they're going to stop an offense like Nebraska. So out is Dylan Raiola. He went to Oregon. He had a really bad offensive line to work behind last year, 115th in the nation in sacks allowed, and they brought in 3 new starters to attempt to fix that. Matt Rule, his ability to recruit has never been questioned, and his ability to coach is now maybe starting to be questioned. I'm not entirely sure what the ceiling of this team is. They brought in a lot of transfers on offense. Obviously, we talked about Dylan Raiola being out, so they brought in UNLV transfer Anthony Colandre, a guy who's a senior and has played a lot of high-level football in his career. They have a good group of wide receivers, highlighted by a transfer from UCLA. At running back, they have Emmett Johnson, who had left and got drafted in the 5th round by the Kansas City Chiefs. He was a big difference maker on offense last year, so they need to replace him, bringing in transfers, bringing in a bunch of guys, a rehauled offensive line, a new quarterback, new starting running back, new wide receivers. I'm not entirely sure what it's going to look like because they also have a new defensive coordinator. Rob Aldrich coming over from San Diego State. He was good. He had a really good defense over there, and he did what he could with the talent he had. So there's a hope that this defense could maybe transform themselves, be top 30-ish, hopefully top 40, but these guys need to prove themselves. Coming over from a little bit lesser of a conference, obviously, and there's a lot of movement on both sides of the ball. I just think Nebraska is going to be battling in that meh tier once again. I don't think, looking at their past couple seasons, obviously 7 straight years of winning 7 games, you'd expect them not to be battling for a bowl. However, I just think their ceiling is limited with the guys they brought in. Maybe they'll surprise me going into this year, but I'm not entirely sold on Nebraska. A team in Rutgers, led by head coach Greg Schiano, 18 years as a head coach of the program of Rutgers over 2 stints, and he was 4-8 last season. The problem was the defense. The defense was absolutely atrocious. Dead last in yards allowed per play. They were missing tackles all over the ball. So bring in new defensive coordinator from South Dakota, obviously the FBS level. So you need to see if he can translate his skills to the Big 10, to the major conferences in college football. However, if his scheme is good, there might be a lot to get excited for at Rutgers. They do need a quarterback, which is the one thing that scares me a little bit about this team. They don't have a clear number 1 in camp, at least it doesn't sound like. They did bring in a couple transfers, then a couple guys in their high school class. The good thing for them is they have a really good group around whoever's going to be playing quarterback. You don't really think of Rutgers as this massive offensive powerhouse. However, last year they were really good on offense, and here's a name you need to know going into this season, potentially for the NFL draft. KJ Duff, wide receiver 1 out of Rutgers. If they can get him the ball, this guy is a problem. Running back, Antoine Raymond, also extremely skilled. However, outside of KJ Duff, outside of Antoine Raymond, I'm a little nervous about their skill position group. Only 2 players total caught 10 passes or more last year. Obviously, KJ Duff is one of those players. And so you're looking at the depth on that wide receiver group being extremely untested. And only 2 offensive linemen are back. And they brought in only 2 transfers, which means they're relying on a high school class, a bunch of guys who will be unproven at the college football level. Oftentimes these schools, especially in the Big 10, they bring in transfers for their offensive line because they've played a lot of football. They're grown men at the position already. So for Rutgers, I just feel like their ceiling is going to be limited. I'm sensing maybe another 4-win season, battling to get to 6 wins and become bowl eligible. Michigan State, led by head coach Pat Fitzgerald, a guy who obviously had a legendary playing career at Northwestern, cleared now of all controversy regarding the hazing scandal that came up during his time when he was at Northwestern as well, coming over to Michigan State in order to try and revamp a team who has seen not a lot of success in recent years. Unfortunately for them, they did lose a bunch of their offensive line, so they're retooling on that side, and the defense is completely overhauled. But for Pat Fitzgerald, I'm sure he wanted to bring in his guys. He wants his defense to play fast. You obviously expect high-level linebacker play, good run defense, and a team that is going to just play with heart, run to the football, and pursue the tackle. So that should be a good sign for Michigan State this year. There'll be a QB competition and a running back competition, as they brought in Cam Edwards, a guy from UConn who almost put up 2,700 yards, 27 touchdowns in the past couple seasons, so 5.6 yards per carry. This guy's a beast. So at Michigan State, if they can gel on the offensive line, if they can come up with a quarterback in camp who is maybe going to be able to move the ball and get the ball to some of their skill position guys, led by a defense who is going to be taking their identity from head coach Pat Fitzgerald, a guy who is a legendary Hall of Fame linebacker, ultimately, Michigan State could maybe do something this year. I'm a little bit nervous though, because I'm not sure this is necessarily the year for them. A lot of new players, Pat Fitzgerald trying to put in his new system because they lost their top wide receiver. They lost a couple guys on defense on the edge in the defensive tackle spot. So for Michigan State, I do think they have the potential to be in that meh tier, but I'm going to say they're going to be battling to try and get to 6 wins and become bowl eligible. A team who might be in the same boat, Purdue. Barry Odom, his second year as head coach, came over from UNLV. In year number 1, Purdue had 54 transfers. Again, that is kind of common when you see a new head coach come in. He brings in his guys. A lot of guys from the previous regime will leave. And for Purdue this year, bringing in 29 transfers again. That's going to be a little bit of concern. Only 38% of their players who played more than 210 snaps for them last year, are returning to the program. When you look at the continuity chart, Purdue does rank pretty low on there. Quarterback Ryan Brown, I do like him as a quarterback. I think he's decent. I think he's a Big Ten level quarterback. I just not entirely sold on his skilled position group. I don't love their wide receivers. I don't love their tight ends. Their offensive line is just okay. I think their running back is not going to be someone you can rely on consistently. So Ryan Brown is going to have to throw the ball, and he's going to have to throw the ball a lot. On defense, they should be all right. They bring in a bunch of guys from last year. There's actually a decent amount of continuity on the defensive side of the ball. It's just really where the offense, where they have almost no continuity. Lots of guys returning on defense. Good size, specifically on the defensive line. So it does give me hope that a team like Purdue can maybe stop the run. However, outside of that, not a lot of hope for this team. Give me Purdue to be in a team battling for bowl, battling to get to 6 wins. I think their ceiling is 6 wins this year, and I'd expect Purdue to finish very easily at the bottom of the conference. Northwestern, a team led by David Brown, they had their best season in the past 5 years last year. Chip Kelly as their offensive coordinator, obviously a guy who has coached in the NFL. He's coached at high-level programs in college football. They have a lot of talent on the offensive side of the ball, and that's maybe not what you'd expect from Northwestern, right? At different times, they've upset teams like Ohio State. They've gone in there in different years and they've played competitive, but oftentimes they're not necessarily seen as one of the top dogs in this conference. David Brown's staff is hoping to change that. Michigan State transfer Aiden Childs came over, and he's a guy that if he can cut down on some of his mistakes, he has a good group of skill position around him. Just rely on your playmakers, move the ball effectively. Northwestern could be a really fun team to watch this year. Obviously for them, a good group of running back, an offensive line that's bringing in 3 new transfers, and sometimes we talk about that as being a negative. However, those 3 transfers average 6'7" and 328 pounds. That is size and experience that can play in the Big Ten. A good group of running backs and tight ends. They brought in one of the top tight ends in all of Division II. Almost 1,200 yards receiving and 14 touchdowns last year as a freshman. So, if his talent translates to the Big Ten, if Aiden Childs can cut down on his turnovers, look for Northwestern to be dangerous on the offensive side of the ball. The problem is, under 50% of their defense returns. They brought in some good transfers, a good high school recruiting class. However, depth might be tested this year. Because let's look at their schedule. At Indiana, at Ohio State, at Oregon, and then home games versus Penn State, Iowa, and Illinois. Now in hindsight, that game against Illinois might be fairly winnable. However, those other 5 games are going to be really tough to win. When you look at it, do you see a winnable game for them between Indiana, Iowa, Ohio State, Oregon, or Penn State? Do you see a winnable game for Northwestern? I don't. If that's 5 losses, or even if that's 4 losses, you're looking for them to be perfect outside of the rest of their season in order to be in our kind of good tier. So, Northwestern is firmly in the meh. However, we're going to put the 2 ends beside each other. I wouldn't be surprised if Northwestern could maybe surprise and win about 8 games this year. I just think that they won't win any more than that because it's just such a tough schedule for Northwestern. A lot of turnover. David Brown coming back again. Obviously with Chip Kelly, they're going to be fun to watch, but limited in what they can do. All right, we are over halfway there. Make sure if you've made it this far in the video, you might as well like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know what you think up to this point. Iowa, a team led by Kurt Ferentz, the winningest G4 school to not make the college football playoffs in the past X amount of years. For them, maybe that's the hump they need to try and get over. They're typically, top 20, top 15-ish, but breaking into the college football playoffs usually requires you to beat some of the big dogs, and that's where Iowa struggles. On offense, they are simply not explosive. They rely on defense and special teams to beat you, running the ball, controlling the clock, and that worked really well when you had quarterback Mark Growinski leading the offense. A guy who I really liked. He put up a lot of touchdowns from the quarterback position, especially with his legs. But for them, he's gone. They brought in quarterback transfers and their backup from last year, but I'm not sold on the quarterback position in Iowa. Again, is it going to matter? I don't know. They have a good group of running backs. They have guys that they can rely on the defensive side of the ball, because that's where they should be, really have their identity. Another top 20 defense would not surprise me out of the Iowa Hawkeyes. Their first 3 games at Michigan, at Ohio State, and at Washington are going to determine the season, because the schedule does get quite a bit easier after that. Just for them, if they struggle in those first 3 games, it's going to be a problem. They have one of their best running backs returning, however, in Kamari Moulton. So Iowa, with a good offensive line, if they can do anything moving the ball through the air, they really could surprise people. Iowa, again, they're firmly going to be in that top 20, you'd expect. I just don't really think a whole lot for them. The ceiling is going to be 9 or 10 wins and a 24th ranking in the college football rankings. Give me Iowa as the next team in our tier. Kinda good. Penn State. I cannot get a read on the Nittany Lions whatsoever. Obviously, Matt Campbell is in and James Franklin is out. James Franklin, I think he maybe got a bad rep at Penn State because he won a lot of games with that program. Brought them to high levels of success. Matt Campbell is in, coming over from Iowa State, and he brought with him a ton of his talent. Quarterback Rocco Becht, a ton of other guys on the offense and defensive side of the ball. 24 players came over with their coach. He brought over his offensive coordinator, and he hired the USC defensive coordinator from last season. So for them, defense might be an issue. I didn't love what USC did last year, but I do love what Iowa State does on defense. So if Matt Campbell is going to have a say on that, their cornerback group, especially their secondary, Iowa State really does a good job on. The defense will be strong. It has lots of size. It has good speed. They're coached by Matt Campbell. I would expect that defense to be really good. However, only 7 out of 35 starters from last year's Penn State team came back. That means obviously a lot of the guys from Iowa State are going to start. But mainly for them, why that worries me, Iowa State hasn't had a top 20 offense in a lot of years. Last year they were 63rd in the nation in total offense. Same quarterback, same guys in most of the skill positions. Obviously they did bring in some transfers, and being at Penn State, you can do a little bit more on the recruiting path than you can at Iowa State. I'm just worried about that depth once the season starts to get long and once you have to play some of the top teams. The good part for Penn State is they avoid most of the top teams on their schedule. So Penn State could end up looking like one of the big dogs at the end of the year, but keep in mind what this roster is. This roster is essentially Iowa State 2.0. So what did you think of Iowa State last year? That's what you're going to think of Penn State this year with some improvements. They are firmly in the tier of kind of good, and I want to rank them as a big dog. I really do. I'm just not sure this is the year for them. Maybe year 2 under Matt Campbell, once he can have a full recruiting cycle at Penn State, might be a little bit better. However, a new defensive coordinator, a new group of guys on offense trying to gel with the guys you brought in from Iowa, I'm not entirely sold on Penn State this year. Okay, the Washington Huskies. If you've been tuning into Sam Center, you know this already, but we'll actually be watching them live when they take on the Washington State Cougars, their in-state rivals, week 1 of the season. Obviously, their big rivalry bowl game. I cannot wait. 65,000 people will be at that stadium screaming, cheering for head coach Jedd Fisch and quarterback Damon Williams Jr. He's back, even if he's maybe a little bit disgruntled. If you are keeping up on the drama in college football, he signed a new deal with Washington last year. And obviously nowadays we're saying these athletes are signing. That's what it is, right? They go out there, they get NIL deals. They say, how much money, what type of sponsorships can you bring in for me? And obviously he liked what he heard at Washington because he decided to come back, sign the paper. Okay, done deal. The last thing you'd expect is your quarterback to then immediately try and enter the transfer program. However, that's what happened. Damon Williams went over there, entered the portal. We don't know exactly who reached out to him. My guess is going to be a team like Texas Tech after missing out on Brendan Sorsby, maybe even LSU when they weren't entirely sure if they were going to go get their guy. I would think there was some big money being thrown out there, but ultimately doesn't really matter because he's back. He signed his deal with Washington. A lot of returning guys on the side of the ball. So I think Washington, if they can get everyone back together, they're going to be good once again. The offense returns a lot of talent. This offensive line is NFL level in my opinion. 4 starters on the offensive line return, and the one starter that they brought in, or at least projected starter, at left tackle from Sam Houston, a guy who was one of the highest recruits that you could bring in the portal. So Washington's team, maybe it takes them a little bit of time to gel, as their top running back is off to the NFL. He got drafted by the Broncos, but they have some running back depth, bringing in the backups from Oregon, from Cal. So I think pairing that with one of the star recruits coming out of high school, the offense in Washington is going to be just fine. Losing Denzel Boston, getting drafted by Cleveland in the NFL does hurt. You brought in wide receiver from Arizona State, a bunch of new guys in the portal. They're young, they're inexperienced. However, I still trust this offense to be really good. The defense should also be one of the big standouts for their team. They're not returning as much talent as the offense is. However, they have good size, good speed. They did lose their top cornerback to the NFL in San Francisco, and then another one got drafted by Cincinnati. This defensive line is a lot of transfers. That's not really a bad thing. There's good size on this defense, a lot of skill. I just think maybe it takes them a couple weeks to gel. Washington has a couple tough games right at the start of their season, and I think that means that their ceiling is going to be limited to being kind of good. People are high on Washington this year. I get it. I do think Damon Williams Jr. is really good. I think that they have a good group on the offensive line, a tough schedule, a really tough conference, losing some of your best talent in the skill position group to the NFL, to other places like that, some change on defense. I'm just not 100% sold on Washington. I do believe they're the best team in that tier, however. 5 teams remain, and these 5 teams, obviously, they're going to be in contention to win the Big 10. So when we talk about these teams, you know what? Don't take it too much if you're a fan of one of them, and I rank them as 5th because all of them are the big dogs going into this season. Let's start at Michigan, a team led by first-year head coach, at least with the Wolverines, in Kyle Whittingham. After 21 years leading the program at Utah, he brought with him his offensive coordinator in Jason Beck, but he didn't bring a ton of his talent. We just talked Penn State, Matt Campbell, bringing with him 29 of his players, whereas Kyle Whittingham brought 5. Those 5 players he brought are quite skilled, but they obviously have their quarterback in Bryce Underwood, a guy who they believe in. He was a high-level recruit coming out of high school, so now he just needs to show that consistency in the pros. Looking at Jason Beck, a guy who was the offensive coordinator at Utah under head coach Kyle Whittingham, so there's familiarity there. He was able to do a lot on the offensive side of the ball that I like, so I have a lot of faith that he can help Bryce Underwood turn things around. Running back 1 is back. The offensive line is experienced. There's good size there, and their top 3 wide receivers are back there as well. The depth outside of the top 3 might be a little bit limited. However, you do have to trust that a school like Michigan brings in a good high school recruiting class. They bring in guys from the transfer portal who should be all right. And really for Michigan, what's going to be success this year? Is it going to be make it to the college football playoffs? I don't know. Because the past couple seasons, under head coach Jim Harbaugh and Sharon Moore in the most recent season, obviously a lot of controversy. And you just want to avoid that if you're Michigan. I think they are one of the big dogs this year. Looking at what Kyle Whittingham has done at Utah, still with Jason Beck, high-level recruits. He's never seen this much talent in a program before in his entire coaching career. So, if they can mesh quickly, Michigan is going to get right back up there, being a tough place to play. The one thing that concerns me is they don't seem super excited or that jazzed up about playing Ohio State. They don't think it's a rivalry game that they need to win. Where if you look at guys like Ryan Day and that roster at Ohio State, they think they're going to lose their job if they don't beat Michigan. So hopefully they get in there, get it in there in the culture, really start to rebuild that program. A team that just won the national championship as of 2 years ago. I think they are maybe one of the worst big dogs in this conference, but Michigan is not going to be an easy place to play. If the cards go right for them, they could easily be ranked within that top 12 and a fringe college football playoff team. And another team, similar vein, USC, led by head coach Lincoln Riley, a guy who showed a lot of success, obviously, at his time with Oklahoma. It's time for him to win at USC. Jaden Mayava, your quarterback, is coming back. I'll put up the quarterback ratings right now from last season in the Big 10. The only guy who had a better rating than him was number 1 overall pick, Fernando Mendoza. Obviously, he's not coming back. So Jaden Mayava has the highest returning QBR out of any of the quarterbacks from last year. 7 out of their 8 wide receivers are gone, but Lincoln Riley can recruit well. He went into the portal and got a bunch of guys and went into the high school recruiting class, got a guy named Booby Feaster, a wide receiver who you will learn his name. Booby is a playmaker and has maybe one of the best names in all of college football. A good offensive line that they have to replace some of their starters last year. However, I'm not worried about that. A team like USC goes out there in the portal, gets the top talent. Obviously, we talked about with Penn State, the defensive coordinator is gone. I don't really know if that's a bad thing, however. They returned both of their running backs. On defense, 66-year-old Gary Patterson is going to lead the defense. He hasn't held a major job since 2021 when he was the head coach of TCU. And let's talk lawsuit once again. His name was cleared, however, and for them, he's back coaching. He is a legendary head coach. In the past, he's developed a system of defense. 4-2-5 is what he's made famous. It was good years ago, but he hasn't had a top 20 defense since 2014. He also hasn't had maybe the level of recruiting that USC can have. The #1 high school recruiting class in the nation, a lot of good skilled playmakers on both sides of the ball. This is the year for USC to try and do something. The problem is an extremely difficult schedule. If they can upset a couple teams, then maybe you will see USC at the college football playoffs. But I think for them, they are very clearly one of the top dogs. You're going to see them surprise some teams on offense and on defense if Gary can get his team rolling, if Lincoln Riley can go out there and try and put some good stuff on tape with Jaden Mayaba. I would look for USC to go out there and be the 10th best team in the nation with a floor of maybe the 20th best. Okay, the top 3, let's get into it. These 3 teams will be firmly in that discussion for the #1 team in this conference. I would think maybe other than USC or Michigan surprising, these 3 teams will be competing once again to win the Big 10 championship game. Let's talk Ohio State, the team that's projected to finish #1 in the Big 10, led by head coach Ryan Day, won the national championship just 2 years ago, returning quarterback Julian Sayin, a guy who might end up winning the Heisman, and offensive coordinator in Arthur Smith coming over from the pros. Ohio State is going to be tough to deal with. They have maybe the best player in all of college football in Jeremiah Smith, their wide receiver, a guy who last year as a freshman absolutely dominated and made everyone know his name. Running back Bo Jackson Jr. If you know that name, you know he's going to be good. There's some rumors out of camp that he's somehow not running back 1. However, I have no doubt by week 2, he'll be running back 1. We talked about offensive coordinator Arthur Smith coming over from the NFL, returning 4 offensive linemen, having all of that talent at running back, at quarterback, at wide receiver. The depth at wide receiver, I'm not entirely sold on, but it's Ohio State, right? It's wide receiver U. Some of these guys I've never heard of are going to end up being some of the best players in all of college football. When you have Jeremiah Smith, when you have Julian Sayin, when you have Bo Jackson, I don't expect them to have any problems moving the ball whatsoever. And on defense, defensive coordinator Matt Patricia, a guy who's held coaching positions at both the NFL and in college football, he's going to have an extremely good defense once again. A big problem for them, 3 out of the 7 top picks in last year's NFL draft came from their defense. Arvell Reese, Caleb Downs, and Sonny Styles. So now you have to replace those guys. They brought in who might be the best player on the defensive side of the ball in all of college football, a safety from Duke, able to come over here and replace Caleb Downs. A good transfer class, good starters on their defensive line, a lot of size. I'm just not entirely sure if it's going to mesh immediately. You have to trust that defensive coordinator, Matt Patricia, head coach Ryan Day. They're going to be competitive right from the start, but only 2 defensive starters are back. And when you look at this schedule, week 2 at Texas, that's a game that they won last year, obviously 14-7, but are they going to be able to go out there and win it again, especially with almost no continuity on the defensive side of the ball? Whereas last year, the best defense maybe that we've ever seen in college football. 3 out of your top 7 picks in the NFL draft came from this defense. So week 2 at Texas, they also play at Indiana, at USC, at Iowa, and then at home versus Oregon. So Ohio State, obviously they're going to be battling for the top of this conference. But the reason I have them right now as the 3rd best team in our power rankings, still firmly as the Big Dogs, is simply because that schedule is going to be tough. And then, when you look at Indiana, the defending national champions, Curt Cignetti's team, I believe they maybe are even better in the preseason than they were last year. Obviously, nobody really knew that Fernando Mendoza was going to be as good as he was, and that Curt Cignetti can turn around a program like Indiana as fast as he could. This is a basketball school through and through. The 3 years previous to Curt Cignetti taking over, they were 9-27. But when he comes in, he wins. 27-2 in those next 2 years, including a national championship. Out is first round, first overall draft pick Fernando Mendoza, 2 1,000-yard running backs, 2 800-yard wide receivers, and 8 total draft picks on that team as a whole. That's what happens when you win the national championship. But somehow, this team might even be better. They brought in quarterback Josh Hoover from TCU, a guy who I think, at least with my limited knowledge in scouting quarterbacks in college football, is better than Fernando Mendoza was before he came into this system. Curt Cignetti's system is known to be a quick read offense. If your first read isn't there, you hand it off or you go immediately to your hot read. That's going to be really good for a guy like Josh Hoover. He can run the ball himself. You know, they have a group of offensive linemen who are going to be extremely strong. Running back Turbo Richard. Are you kidding me right now? Their running back is named Turbo? They are going to be incredible. A really good group of guys at wide receiver, at tight end, a solid defense with good size, good speed. If they can recover from losing a lot of the talent that they lost last year, if there's no championship hangover, which I cannot expect that Curt Cignetti would allow whatsoever, look for Indiana to return to the Big Ten championship game. We obviously haven't had any of these teams in the past couple years repeat as national champions. I do think it's going to be really difficult to do that, but they smoked Oregon last year. They beat them 56-22, and I might like this Indiana team more. So they are firmly the second best team in the Big Ten with the potential to be maybe the best team. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. There's only one team left, so I guess that spoils the surprise. Dan Lanning's team in Oregon. This is your year. No more excuses. You went out there last year thinking it was your year, and you got smoked 56-22 to Indiana. An opening pick 6 by Dante Moore. And obviously the team has a bad taste in their mouth from last year. Returning starter Dante Moore. A guy who very easily could have been the second best quarterback in that draft. In a draft class that had a weak quarterback room, he probably was going to the New York Jets. He knows that. Everybody knows that. And so he decided to himself, hey, I'm going to return to Oregon for one more year. They pay a lot of money. Obviously, the head of Nike runs our NIL budget, so we have unlimited funds, a ton of really fun new uniform combinations, and a team that has the potential to win the national championship game. Dante Moore said, sign me up if the alternative is playing for the New York Jets. Unfortunately for you, Dante, the New York Jets are probably going to be there next year ready to pick you again. For Oregon, both of their coordinators are gone, losing their two head coaching positions at Kentucky and Cal, but Dan Lanning was ready for this. He promoted both of his coordinators from within, and so ultimately these are guys who know his system. They know how to play within his desired squad, so I would expect Oregon to be just fine with both their coordinators. This defense is returning almost all of their starters. You are going to see the same thing from Ohio State last year, where a bunch of these guys are drafted early, because this group, I think, has potential to be the best group in all of college football. Now, when we talk the SEC, I think Alabama, Georgia, and Texas all have extremely good defenses this year. So I'm going to say Oregon, a top 5 defense in all of college football, maybe even the best. An offensive line that might be the best in all of college football as well. It's going to be scary. As much as they're only bringing in 2 starters, this team is loaded with the guys they brought in. They're absolutely massive, the size on their offensive line. And in the past 4 years, this team has not lost a game to anyone who hasn't gone on to play in the national championship game. So that's really good and also kind of bad. That shows that you are firmly one of the best teams in the nation. However, you are not the best team in the nation on any given year. Losing a game that wasn't even close to Indiana, that team was obviously special. However, Miami went out there and lost a close one in the national championship game where you got blown out 56-22. 48-8 in the last 4 years. Like we mentioned, they haven't lost to anyone who hasn't gone out there to play for the national championship game. The past 3 winners being Indiana, Ohio State, and Michigan. All the stars are aligning. Oregon has the roster. Losing a tight end getting drafted to the NFL, they replace him with another guy who should go in the first 2 rounds in the NFL draft. A quarterback in Dante Moore who's going to be a top 5 overall pick. Running backs who can pick up the slack when they need to. You're going to see multiple 1,000 yards rushers on this team. I think Oregon is the ultimate top dog. We're going to put him over there under our boy Tiger, dapping him up, because I think Oregon is going to win the Big Ten. I believe Oregon is going to be firmly in there in contention for the college football playoffs, and the Sam Center official prediction is Oregon versus Notre Dame for the national championship. Let me know in the comments down below, were we right, were we wrong? Let's throw up the tier list one more time. Are there any surprises here? Are there teams where you think Sam Center, how could you have ranked them in that position? Ultimately, that's the whole point of these. It's preseason. You see last year's ranking up there on the screen, so a lot can change. Teams like Penn State, can they turn things around in a hurry? Can Indiana build on their national championship winning squad from last year? Will UCLA and Bob Chesney reload? And maybe can a team like Illinois, Rutgers, Michigan State, or Purdue surprise us? I cannot wait to find out, just a few short weeks away from the college football season. Thank you so much for being here. Sam Center, new episode tomorrow, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Take a look at the channel. There might be some other videos that you're excited to watch. The Sam Center Instagram is popping right now. Thank you once again. We're out.